energi, bukanlah hanya sebuah reaksi.
Dia selalu ada dimanapun itu,
membawa yang baik menjadi hebat.
Setinggi apa kamu bisa melompat?
Jawabannya, setinggi apa yang kamu ingin gapai?
Karena tidak ada lagi batas. Kemanapun lintasan masa membawa,
Harapan, hati, dan mata yang berkelana, dari masa kini hingga ke masa depan.
Yang sebentar lagi bisa kamu genggam.
Sejauh mana kamu bisa bermimpi?
Jawabannya, sejauh yang hati kamu inginkan.
Dengan energi yang menggerakkan kamu,
Dan kamu. Pertamina, energizing you.
The Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia, FEBUI, is a modern, dynamic, and welcoming campus, a place to study for the nation's future leaders. Situated in two strategic locations, Depok and Salemba, we are fully committed to contribute to the development of knowledge in economics and business, and to nurture future leaders with a sense of social responsibility and the ability to address global environmental changes. For over 65 years, we have produced the country's best graduates that will potentially play important roles both in the Indonesian government and the private sector.
So my name is Thijs Hesselmans, I'm from Blanda, and one of the many things I like about Fakultas Economie and Business Universitas Indonesia is that the campus is really green. It's wonderful.
In the future, we are aiming to become Asia's leading economics and business learning center, which contributes to the development of Indonesia and the global community. FEBUI has three departments: the Department of Economics, the Department of Management, and the Department of Accounting, with specified courses such as With more than 65 years of experience as a prestigious educational institution in Indonesia, we have become one of the few that consistently produce the best graduates in the country. The development of FEBUI is not only limited in the standard degree education, but also in non-degree education, research, and consulting. Through cooperation, we always strive to provide benefits for both parties involved.
Hi, I'm Narumi Ishikawa from Japan Chiba University. Thank you for FEB to expanding my knowledge. Thank you for Universitas Indonesia. Terima kasih banyak.
Currently, there are plenty of FEB-UI graduates who occupy key positions, both in the government and private companies, local and international. The Faculty of Economics and Business University of Indonesia welcomes the entire academic community with open arms to achieve a bright and successful future together.
Part of FEB.
Recording in progress.
FEB-UI, massive campus with great people and unique local people.
Di era digital saat ini, selalu terkoneksi menjadi sangat berarti untuk memulai aktivitas sehari-hari.
Halo nak, Mama mau berangkat ke check up. Doakan hasilnya bagus ya.
Amin. Nanti Brian transferin ya.
Dengan Brimo, kamu juga bisa memulai harimu dengan membantu orang tua tercinta. Listrik rumah untuk tetap terus menyala. Mengisi ulang uang elektronik cukup dari jarimu seperti ini. Buat dana belanja online, kamu bisa apply ceria dari Brimo. Scan kris di Brimo melancarkan pembayaran tanpa perlu bersentuhan langsung. Dan kamu bisa memilih cara pembayaran scan QR yang tersedia. Brimo, mobile banking yang pas buatmu.
Energi
Selalu ada dimanapun itu,
Membawa yang baik menjadi hebat.
karena tidak ada lagi batas.
Manapun lintasan masa membawa hingga ke masa depan.
Sejauh mana kamu bisa bermimpi?
Jawabannya, sejauh yang hati kamu inginkan.
Dengan energi yang menggerakkan kamu
Dan kamu. Pertamina, energizing you.
the Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia, FEBUI, is a modern,
Halo, selamat pagi.
campus, a place to study for the nation's future leaders. Situated in two strategic locations, Depok and Salemba, we are fully committed to contribute to the development of knowledge in economics and business, and to nurture future leaders with a sense of social responsibility and the ability to address global environmental changes. For over 65 years, we have produced the country's best graduates that will potentially play important roles both in the Indonesian government and the private sector.
So my name is Assc. I'm from Blanda, and one of the many things I like about Fakultas Economy and Business Universitas Indonesia is that the campus is really green. It's wonderful.
In the future, we are aiming to become Asia's leading economics and business learning center, which contributes to the development of Indonesia and the global community. FEBUI has three departments: the Department of Economics, the Department of Management, and the Department of Accounting, with specified courses such as With more than 65 years of experience as a prestigious educational institution in Indonesia, we have become one of the few that consistently produce the best graduates in the country. The development of FEBUI is not only limited in the standard degree education, but also in non-degree education, research, and consulting. Through cooperation, we always strive to provide benefits for both parties involved.
Hi, I'm Narumi Ishikawa from Japan, Chiba University. Thank you for FEB to expanding my knowledge. Thank you for Universitas Indonesia. Terima kasih banyak.
Currently, there are plenty of FEBUI graduates who occupy key positions, both in the government and private companies, local and international. The Faculty of Economics and Business University of Indonesia welcomes the entire academic community with open arms to achieve a bright and successful future together.
Part of FEBUI.
Be part of FEBUI for a better future. FEBUI, massive campus with great people and unique local food.
Jadikan harimu beyond dengan Brimo. Fitur lengkap untuk jalani hari, ada top up pulsa atau paket data. Top up berisi mudah untuk pergi ke tempat kerja. Bayar praktis dengan kris. Belanja online makin asik, tinggal klik. Mau transfer pun tak jadi masalah. What a beyond day, Brimo. mobile banking yang pas buatmu.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the second day of the International Conference on Business and Management Research, ICBMR 2022, Building Competitive and Collaborative Business in the Disruptive Era. This conference is sponsored by Pertamina, Bank Rakyat Indonesia, Bank Sentral Asia, and organized by Management Research Center, Universitas Indonesia.
ICBMR is organized by Management Research Center, Department of Management, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia, that aims to provide an excellent international platform for the academicians, researchers and budding students around the world to share their research findings and to find international linkage for future collaborations in the areas of business, management, and economics. Previously, ICBMR had been held in Bali, Jakarta, Manila, Ho Chi Minh, Seoul, Kyoto, Lombok, Padang, and last year ICBMR is held virtually. The theme for this year is building competitive and collaborative business in the disruptive era. Again, ICBMR is held as a virtual conference where there will be online presentations, doctoral colloquium, and webinar keynote speeches. Our keynote speakers are Professor Kiyoshi Kobayashi from Kyoto University and Associate Professor Yuri Mansury from Illinois Institute of Technology. The supporting journal for ICBMR 2022 are Indonesian Capital Market Review, ASEAN Marketing Journal, the Southeast Asian Journal of Management, International Journal of Islamic Microfinance, Journal Pendidikan Ekonomi dan Bisnis, and supporting publisher UI Publishing for proceeding. Our special thanks to our sponsors Pertamina, Bank Rakyat Indonesia, and Bank Central Asia.
Distinguished participants, before we begin, I would like to remind you the webinar session rules. First, participants are asked to fill in the attendance form provided in the Zoom chat room. And second, upon the Q&A session, participants can ask questions via Q&A room by mentioning their full name, institution, and questions. Lastly, our moderator will be the one who selects and read the question from participants. It has been a pleasure for us to have Professor Yuri Mansury as our keynote speaker today. He is currently the Associate Professor at the Department of Social Sciences, Illinois Institute of Technology, who also teaches urban planning analysis. He received his PhD degree from Cornell University and postdoctoral fellowship from Harvard and MIT. His work revolves around the economics of technology and innovation, computational model of urban system, spatial networks, disaster impact analysis, and unbalanced regional development. And of course, he has published his research in multiple social science journals such as Computers, Environment, and Urban System, Journal of Economic Dynamic and Control, as well as Regional Science Policy and Practice. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Yuri Mansury.
Thank you for having me. I want to first thank you, the ICBMR organizer, for inviting me. It is a great honor to present for my alma mater, Universitas Indonesia. Thank you, everyone. So do I still have 45 minutes for my presentation, more or less?
Yes, but
okay.
Professor Yuri, you can start your presentation now, and then we can have a Q&A sessions afterwards.
Okay. So can everyone see my PDF?
Yes.
Right now. Okay, yeah, so thank you for the great introduction. Once again, my name is Yuri Mansury, and I'm associate professor of social sciences for Illinois Tech. And some of the work that I am going to present actually is based on research that I did with my research collaborator, Meng Yu, who is now a PhD researcher at Ohio State. And some of the slides here I already presented during the Henry S. Morrow lecture hosted by Universitas Andalas last July. But I'm going to take a different direction and focus on agglomeration economies and the impact on productivity, as well as talk about the state of Indonesian transportation infrastructure. So let me begin with this observation about the trend on population concentration in cities. So 2007 is the first time where there is more people live in cities than in rural areas. And this is a relatively recent phenomenon because for millennia, practically hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens are essentially rural creatures. So this is a phenomenon where there are more city people than the rural population is relatively recent. And by 2050, so that's about 30 years from now, more than 2/3, so 66% of the population, are expected to live in cities or urban areas. So what about Indonesia? So look at the data for Indonesia here. So starting from about 12% of the population is in the urban area in the 1950s, that's a 12%. Okay, we crossed the threshold in 2010, where half of Indonesians live in cities, and here we are today in 2022. A couple of years ago, the proportion of Indonesians who live in urban areas is 56%. So that is pretty much in line with the world population trend. So we can think of ourselves as kind of typical in terms of the share of urban population. And then we compare Indonesia with other Southeast Asian countries. Maybe no surprise, Singapore, which is a small nation city, has 100% of the population, all urban. But there are only two other countries in Southeast Asia with a higher percentage of urban population. One is Brunei, that's another small nation state, and Malaysia with 77% of population urban. But compared to the rest of ASEAN, for example, Indonesia has more urban population. And so the question is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, before we talk about whether it's good or bad, let me talk about one implication first, namely that urbanization implies increased concentration of population and economic activities in cities. So what that means is we are observing this rising density of cities. A simple definition of a density is just a total population divided by the geographic area. Okay, and I'll show you, what are some of the Indonesian cities with the highest population density currently. But if you look at the data, for example, for the US, which is a very big country, just like Indonesia, so the majority of American population, 220 million, actually are concentrated in about 4% of the US area, geographic area. So only very small area in the US is actually occupied by people, because most of the interior US, at least the continental part of the US, is basically empty space. Okay, most Americans live in cities, coastal and other urban areas, and that's about 4% of the entire, gigantic American geography. Here's another interesting observation is that the number of people that live in an area is almost perfectly correlated with the built environment. And what that means is we can use indicator of a built environment, like a building or structures, as an indicator of how urbanized a population is. Okay, so what about Indonesia? Okay, what percentage of the Indonesian geography or territory is urban? Does anyone know? Well, I actually don't have the data for that. So instead, I will ask an alternative question. What percentage of the Indonesian territory is actually made up of a built-up environment? And the definition of built-up, according to the OECD, is the presence of a buildings. And what that means is a roof structures. Okay. So other urban environment like the road transportation network, parking lots, they don't count as a built environment, not according to OECD. Other urban space like parks and gardens, also don't count because we only count buildings, which has a roof on top. So any guess what percentage of Indonesia is actually made up of a built environment? Well, when I saw this number, I was very surprised. It's less than 1%. And Indonesia is a very big country also, just like the US. But less than 1% of the entire Indonesian archipelago, right? Because we are not a continental like the US, is made up of thousands of islands, right? But less than 1% of the entire Indonesian area is actually made of the built environment, buildings as defined by the OECD. Even Singapore, if you look at this table, only 34% of the entire Singapore geography is made up of the built environment. So, typically for any country, only very small percentage of the entire area is made of a building. What about the rest? Well, we have a lot of open space, right? Open space, that's in addition to other structures like the transportation network, park, and maybe water bodies or things of that nature. Okay, but the main takeaway from this is that we have a population that is increasingly concentrated only in certain parts of the country, and they are called cities or urbanized area. Okay, so if you look at the satellite images, for nighttime Indonesia, based on the intensity of the lights, right? I think we can see the population centers, clusters, mostly in Java, Bali, and some in Sumatra, obviously. But if you look at the outer islands, right, only some parts of Kalimantan, Sulawesi, and Papua, are lighted according to this map. And we can look at some of the densest cities in Indonesia. Some of them are the usual suspects. Obviously Jakarta is in there. So the definition of density is just population divided by area. So Jakarta is second in this list with a density of 15,900 people per square kilometer. And then we have places like Yogyakarta and Medan, where I was born, is there at the bottom of the list. Maybe surprisingly, Kupang is number one, but that's because Kupang has a very small area, right? The density is a function of both population and area. And so if the area is very small, like Kupang, it's going to have a very high density in terms of a population. So why does the density matter? Coming from a background in urban economics and regional science, which is my PhD training, we generally believe that density is a good thing. For reasons that economists generally also believe. So you think about various indicators of economic development. This is a one paper that summarizes, many of the findings and published just a couple of years ago. So the key finding here is that higher density is associated to higher wages. So that's a one indicator for economic development, but also higher innovation in terms of patent activities. And then in terms of sustainable development, measured by preservation of a green space, lower car use, lower energy consumption. We like it because it means less fossil fuel consumption, right? And then in terms of other social indicators like crime and the cost of providing public services, okay? And there is one key finding here that I want to highlight, which is the density elasticity of wages. And what that means is that every 1% increase in density is associated with 8%, 0.08 here, so 8% increase in wages, for developing countries. That's actually very significant and considerable impact on wages. So we think about the various policies and strategies, to promote economic development. One strategy that we can think of is to promote even more concentration of people in cities, because according to the evidence here, it's actually going to lead to higher wages. At the same time, we're aware, obviously, that there are problems like slower traffic congestion, higher pollution concentration, and so forth. But on balance, right, economists and regional scientists, including me, believe that on balance, higher density is a good thing, measured according to various indicators, including wages, income, and things of that nature. So there is a notion in my field that density is a good thing because it generates agglomeration economies. So the question is, what is an agglomeration economy? So a useful comparison is with the concept of a scale economies. So I'm talking to an audience of FAUE graduate and students, so at some point we've been exposed to the concept of a scale economies, right? Which refer to the reduction in average cost per unit of output when a firm increases output. So in simple terms, the more a firm produces, then the lower average cost will be. That's the concept of scale economies. Okay, so generally the term economies imply an economic benefit. So in the case of agglomeration economies, okay, they refer to the benefits that come when firms and people locate in the proximity of one another, so near one another in cities and urban areas. So that's one definition of agglomeration economies. So what is the advantage of agglomeration economy? Why is it a big deal? From the point of view of employees or workers who have job in the cities, it's definitely a good thing, according to the evidence here, because there is a strong positive relationship between density and wages. So that means the higher the density is, the more concentrated the population is, then people can also expect to earn higher income or wages. Okay, from cities with a higher concentration or higher density. But this is based on observations in developed economies, typically Western economies like the US and Europe and Japan. That begs a question, right? What about the developing world? What about Indonesia? And this is one quote here from Glaser, who is a professor at Harvard Economics Department. In his textbook, he admitted, well, there is nothing here on agglomeration economies in the developing world. Okay, but there is some evidence here that I can offer today. This is based on my own research at the city level. So this is based on 2 years of data, 2010 and 2020, again at the city level. And I have 4 variables where G represents per capita income growth between those 2 years. And then D is the main explanatory variable of interest because D represents population density in 2010, the initial year. So if you look at the regression result here, and I'm assuming again, because everyone as an economist, to some degree, whether students or faculty or alumni. The result here, provides empirical support that higher density is associated with a higher growth in per capita income. So this is a very simple model, but if I use a slightly more complicated model, specification 3, for example, where I include additional control variables for services and the proportion of female in the labor force, then we get a coefficient 0.0469 here. So that's about 4.7% increase in income for every 1% increase in density. That is pretty much in line with the evidence for the developed economies like the US and Europe. It is not as high as the prediction for the rest of the developing countries, but that's pretty good. That's really pretty good. Again, we think about various strategies like education, right? That we think can promote economic development. Well, it looks like promoting density, right, will also at least should receive consideration as a viable strategy to promote economic development, at least in terms of income growth. So I have argued that density is good for workers and employees, but the question is it good for businesses, right? Faculty of economics and business. So we want to know what's the implication for business. And that's because in cities, companies, firms, and businesses have to pay higher costs of employees, right? Workers are more expensive, and that's sort of the downside for businesses, to locate in urban population centers like a city. So assuming rational decision makers, if we assume that the business executives are rational, I'm sure some location decisions are based on nostalgia, because I used to grow up in Jakarta, so I'm gonna start a business in Jakarta also, right? I was born in Medan, so it's gonna be more likely for me to start a business in Medan as well. So that's for nostalgia reason, and there is also historical reason. But in economics, we believe that by and large, companies are rational decision makers, right? So assuming rational behavior, why are firms willing to locate in places where workers are more expensive? And not to mention, higher cost of congestion, pollution, higher crime, and so on, right? So if we believe that businesses are rational, right, there must be something about cities that offer some kind of a compensation. Because if there is no compensation, there is only the negative aspect of a higher wages and higher pollution. In that case, firms might as well be located, in rural areas instead of the cities where wages are cheaper. So the fact that they choose to locate in cities, that means there is something about the cities that offer compensation that actually exceed the higher cost of workers and higher pollution and so on, right? That's what it means to make a rational decision about location. So here's some evidence. Again, I will start with the evidence for the developed economy, in particular the US here. In the US, higher employment density, so higher concentration is found to lead to increase in productivity, worker productivity, in the US by 6%. Okay, so this is the compensation for businesses. Yes, they do have to pay the employees, higher wages, and they have to deal with a congestion problem and so on, but they get compensated in return by the higher productivity of their workers, Okay, so that compensation is more than offset the downside of higher employee costs and other costs associated with the density. So how do firms become more productive in cities? I'll review briefly some of the theoretical explanations in the literature. I'm not going to be able to talk about them all in the interest of time. Some of the sources of higher productivity include sharing. What that means is that if everyone is concentrated in one location, multiple businesses in one location, then we need only one parking lot, just an example, or one power generator, right? Whereas if they're more spread out in in multiple locations, then we'll need multiple parking lots, right? And multiple power generators and multiple waste processing facilities and so on. So if everyone is concentrated in one location, it's going to allow these businesses to share a small number of infrastructure facilities, and that contributes to higher productivity. Okay, higher the density also is associated with labor pooling that contributes to better matching. So there is an analog here to matching for life partners, like when we're looking for a life partner like a wife or husband, right? You're going to be more likely to find a better match when we are in the city, just because there are more choices. So we're going to be more likely to find somebody that fits our personality and meets our criteria and so on. That's the idea for matching. Actually, the same model that is used for the dating market is also used for the modeling of a labor market in urban areas, because they use the same logic. And also the notion of learning. One aspect is attributed to knowledge spillovers. And that means if you are in the proximity, live close to someone with greater skills, more experience than us, then that will allow us to learn from this more experienced and more skilled, maybe also more educated neighbors. Okay, so this is one form of externality. It is an externality because it is not internalized in terms of higher wages, right? It's just a benefit that we get from being next door to someone who is more skilled, but that benefit is actually not monetized, in terms of salaries or wages or anything like that. So all these different mechanisms, sharing, matching, and learning, imply some kind of a business cooperation, right, or collaboration. Businesses get together in one place and they collaborate. Okay, but there is another view. Okay, and this is due to Michael Porter, another Harvard professor. This one is at business school. And if you learn about the 5 forces, because you're interested in management consultant, for example, you might have come across to Michael Porter at some point. It's the same Michael Porter, but this time he's talking about business clusters. Okay, and according to cluster, in addition to cooperation, there is also the element of competition. This is a great match here for this year's ICBMR, because this year's topic is about both cooperation and competitiveness, right? And so Porter puts both cooperation and competition, in the same sentence here. The benefit of a business cluster, not only it promotes cooperation, but also it drives people, to become more competitive. Okay, because we have this cluster of businesses, slightly differentiated with from one another, right? So everyone is competing, to be better. So it's pretty clear that local rivalry, according to Porter, is highly motivating. It's a peer pressure because you're next to your competitor, and that's going to amplify the competitive pressure, within an industrial cluster. Okay, so we have talked about the logic of agglomeration economy and why we think in urban economics and digital science, density is a good thing. But what is the role of transportation in industrial clusters? Okay, because we think about if we all live in one area, right? And then maybe we have our relatives who live in some other places. So I grew up in Jakarta, and then I have my grandparents, live in Situbondo. And when we want to see them, maybe we'll take a flight or take the train, to go to Surabaya, and then drive from Surabaya to Situbondo, or the other way around. They will take a flight or take a train, from Surabaya to see me and my family in Jakarta, right? So having access to transportation infrastructure is key, because if the transportation infrastructure is accessible to everyone, that's going to give us the confidence, to go in cities. Because even though we live in a city, you could still easily visit our relatives, right, in other towns and places. That's kind of the role of a transportation infrastructure. So according to some pundits, journalists, I have in mind here one particular journalist, whose name is Thomas Friedman, and his book, for years is in a New York Times bestseller list. It's titled "The World is Flat." Okay, and his claim is that because of all these advances in transportation technology and high-speed communication, we are doing it right now. We are having a meeting on Zoom, right? Long distance. I'm in Chicago, and my audience is in. Are you in Depok right now, or in Jakarta? In Depok right now, right?
Depok, yes.
So according to Tom Friedman, at least, because of all these technological advances, the world is flat, or at least flatter than before. But in fact, the opposite is true. Transportation, according to the evidence, which I don't have time to talk the details, actually promote even more concentration, even more clustering of our people in cities. But this evidence, again, is quite limited. One limitation is that the literature often ignores urban transportation because of the lack of data. One study here, again, is from the US, that found that an increase in transportation infrastructure in terms of highway infrastructure also contribute to an increase in employment, okay, significantly. Well, yeah, that's the US. So what about Indonesia? But before we talk about Indonesia, let's talk a little bit about the theoretical framework. This is due to Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize winner. The model is a bit complicated, but the prediction is a pretty straightforward here, which is that low transport costs, okay, essentially will lead to agglomeration economies. In other words, if you lower transport costs, it's going to lead to more concentration of people and economic activities in cities and urban areas. So that's the prediction, the theoretical prediction. So what is the evidence? Is there any evidence in support of the theory here? So the evidence for China, this is by another Nobel Prize winner, Banerjee, and also actually there are two of them, Banerjee and Esther Duflo, that won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago. And this is just published 2020 in the Journal of Economic Development. So according to Banerjee and associates, the closer regions are to transportation network infrastructure, okay, the higher the level of GDP per capita will be. So that has implication for economic development, albeit with a higher income inequality. So that's a kind of a trade-off between higher GDP per capita and higher inequality. But at the same time, higher number of firms. So that's, one indicator of economic development, and higher profits, right? So good for business for regions that are located in the proximity of a transportation infrastructure. That's China. What about Indonesia? Well, unfortunately, the literature for Indonesia is a little bit thin right now. I did a little bit of a Google search last night using Google Scholar. I found one study. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. One of the key findings is that in Indonesia, transportation infrastructure does have a positive effect on economic growth, okay, just like in China. But at the same time, at least indirectly, infrastructure reduces income inequality, unlike China. So this is almost too good to be true here, right? Just reading between the lines, it appears that for Indonesia, there is no trade-off. Infrastructure, it's like having a cake and be able to eat it too, because it can promote higher economic growth and at the same time lower economic disparities. So why not, focus on infrastructure development in Indonesia? So here's the state of transportation infrastructure in Indonesia. In 2018, according to the Global Competitiveness Report, we are right in the middle among 140 countries. We were ranked 71st, right? Right in the middle, okay, in terms of infrastructure competitiveness. You look at the East Asian region, okay, where the average quality is this number 3.01. That's just one measure. Maybe unsurprisingly, only 3 ASEAN members, score higher than that. Singapore, no surprise, but also Malaysia and Thailand. Okay, but everyone, including Indonesia, scores below the East Asian average. So that means that there is plenty of room here for improvement. Okay, maybe motivated by that, right? In the latest RPJMN, this is Rencana Pembangunan Jangka Menengah Panjang Nasional. I grew up at a time where we call it Rapelita. Now it's called RPJMN, right? The latest one. So the budget for infrastructure spending was estimated to be, this much, about 6,000 trillion. So that's about $4 billion in the current exchange rate, because that's a huge amount, obviously. So of this amount, about 60% will be allocated to transportation infrastructure. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into the details of the RPJMN. So there are several strategic projects that are prioritized in the current long-term plan here, but I'm just going to focus on one, okay, because it's allocated a substantial amount of money, 63 trillion rupiah, and it also intersects very nicely with my own research on high-speed rail. So this is a project on a high-speed rail to connect Jakarta and Bandung. That is scheduled to be completed sometime at the end of this decade, according to plan. Okay, so when this project is completed, Indonesia is going to have the first high-speed rail transportation infrastructure in Southeast Asia. Singapore doesn't have high-speed rail. Malaysia doesn't have one. Thailand doesn't have one. We are going to be the first with HSR infrastructure when this line between Bandung and Jakarta is completed. And it is also going to be the first outside of China that makes use of a Chinese technology. Okay, and just last month, look at the Jakarta Post article here. 8 of the Chinese-made trains, had already arrived at Tanjung Priok, or one of the Jakarta ports. So this is definition of a high-speed rail, maximum speed of 350 kilometers per hour. So for the Jakarta-Bandung line, the distance is 142 kilometers. So SSR will cut down, the trip time, from the current average of 3 hours to just 40 minutes, right? So it's a very significant reduction in travel time between Jakarta and Bandung. So this is a reflection, across the world, not just in Indonesia. This is a one quote here from the then U.S. President Barack Obama. This is 2009. I'll read it to you. Major new high-speed rail line will generate many thousands of construction jobs over several years, as well as the permanent jobs for rail employees and increased economic activity in the destinations these trains serve. So obviously, former President Obama is a politician, right? So this reflects his belief. Is this actually supported by the evidence? Well, yes. At least in terms of GDP and employment, the evidence, again, for developed economies, for Germany that has a high-speed rail line, the infrastructure contributes to a higher GDP as well as to a higher employment rate. So just a note here, the US still doesn't have high-speed rail line, okay? So when and if we have high-speed rail, right, we're gonna be more developed than the US in that sense, because the US right now still doesn't have, high-speed rail transportation infrastructure. So you look across other countries, for the current SSR development, in England, for example, there is this line being planned right now. It's going to connect London to Birmingham. So I'm going to draw your attention here to the cost per kilometer, and compare that with other projects, right? So in England, that line that's going to connect London to Birmingham and Manchester is estimated to cost $126 million per kilometer. Okay. In the US, there is there's a couple actually being proposed. One is the Bay Area corridor. It's going to connect Los Angeles to San Francisco. And then there's another line in Texas that's going to connect Houston to Dallas. And the cost is estimated to be $56 million per kilometer. Now, if you look at China, that is a completely different animal altogether. First of all, look at the length. 37,900 kilometers, right? That's 100 times the length of the proposed California line. So that's order and magnitude much larger. This is a completely different beast, compared to the SSR in Japan or in Europe. Very different in terms of the scale of the SSR infrastructure. But at the same time, the Chinese has been able to do it at lower cost, $25 million, per kilometer. What is the budget for the Jakarta-Bandung SSR line? Well, according to some estimate, it's going to be closer to the US in terms of costs, about $55 million per kilometer. Okay, so as an economist, right? Anytime we spend a lot of money, our natural inclination is it worth it, right? Is it worth it to spend $55 million per kilometer on SSR when there are other alternatives, like maintaining and developing our highway infrastructure, for example, or just conventional train, or just buses like a Damri and so on, right? What is the opportunity cost of high-speed rail that makes it worthwhile for us, to develop high-speed rail in Indonesia? So certainly, one part of it is driven, just like in the US, Obama, by the belief that high-speed rail will deliver substantial economic impact. So it's useful, to take a look at the case of China, where we have done some study on the economic impact of high-speed rail. And again, if you look at China, China alone, transportation infrastructure, the length of the track lines, is 8 times the second position, which is Spain. So China, by far is number 1 in terms of a high-speed rail infrastructure. So it would be a good case study in terms of the economic impact. So if you look at the case of China, China invests a lot in general. Okay, they invest about half of the GDP on average on various fixed asset investment. Okay, and about a quarter of that, 1/4, is allocated to infrastructure development, at least in the last 10 years. So that's about every year, 10% of a Chinese GDP is allocated to infrastructure development. In Indonesia, that's about 5%, half of it, half of that, half of the percentage for China, right? China has a much larger GDP, and it allocates 1/10 of their output to infrastructure development and maintenance. So among the various infrastructure items, transportation is definitely the most dominant, accounting for about 3/4, so 75% of infrastructure spending. And the one transportation mode that has received the highest attention is a rail network, not just high-speed rail, but also conventional rail. It has increased by more than 75% since 1990. So China has invested a lot in the railways, not just high-speed, but also conventional rail infrastructure. So there's a couple of questions that Meng and I and our co-authors address in our research. We know the relationship between high-speed rail and urbanization in China. And we also want to know, this is the second question, what is the implication for China's agricultural land? Because if you think about, if high-speed rail attracts more people to come to the cities, right? This new residents, this from other places, other cities, and also from rural areas, have to live somewhere. So we need to provide housing, for these new residents. Where are they going to live, right? So one option is they're going to have to live maybe in a suburb, in the periphery of the city center, right? In the Jabodetabek area, not in the city center. What that means is that we're going to have to convert some of the agricultural land, to residential housing, right? So that these newcomers can have a place to live, ideally. So the Chinese SSR infrastructure is huge. Okay, this is a behemoth, and that's an understatement. There is a passing by agricultural land, across China. Okay, so there is definitely an important question is whether the development of a Chinese SSR infrastructure is taking away some of the agricultural land, because the Chinese policymakers are very sensitive to food sustainability. And if there's evidence that some project is actually depleting, taking away some of the agricultural land, that may be considered a threat to food sustainability, because it's going to have an impact on food security and so forth. So this is a sensitive issue in China, as it may be the case as well in Indonesia. So that's the question that we address in this research that we just published this year, actually, just came out a couple of months ago in Applied Geography. But if you look at the map of the HSR network infrastructure, China is very big, much larger than Indonesia. Okay, if you look at the infrastructure, the distinctive feature is the grid structure. So there are 4 lines going from east to west, and then another 4 lines going from north to south. Mostly in eastern China, some in central China in the middle. There is that 1 line that goes all the way to the west, to the border with Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. But right now, it's mostly in eastern China. But the plan, right, is going to include all cities in China with a population of at least 1 million people. So we will see even more expansion of the Chinese HSR infrastructure. So what is the impact of HSR network expansion on rural-urban migration in China? And I'm coming to a close here very soon. So look at the evidence here. I'm just going to talk about the first line here that says that in China, high-speed rail does actually lead to rural-urban migration. So more people migrate to the cities because they're attracted to access to HSR network. So that's the evidence for China. Okay, so I'm coming to my conclusion here. Just a couple more slides. That in China, the Chinese high-speed rail, contributes to the acceleration or urbanization, through rural-urban migration. And so we think about everything that we talked about in the beginning, right? Potentially, at least, high-speed rail would contribute to higher productivity, via agglomeration economies. But obviously, higher density comes with a social cost, congestion, higher crime, and pollution, and so forth. So we have to consider those as well in our cost-benefit calculation. For China, we found that SSR has also led to agricultural land depletion. So the taking away of agricultural land, for various urban uses. So that has an implication for sustainable development, right? Because we're taking away some land from agricultural activity for urban uses. So that has an implication for food security and sustainability. There is also implication for economic disparities. And this is my last slide here. The cost of SSR in China. This is the cheapest second class price. From Beijing to Shanghai, that's $85. That's the lowest cost. Because if you think about, is that how much SSR going to cost? Between Jakarta and Bandung. Well, right now, the cost to fly from Jakarta to Bali is cheaper than that. Last time I checked, maybe not Garuda, okay, but there are other options. I'm flying that are cheaper than the cost of high-speed rail in China, right? So that's one thing to think about, because who can afford, this high-speed rail accessibility and mobility? Well, typically the middle and upper class people. So that has an economic development implication, because potentially it could actually widen the gap, right, between the low income and the high income, because the economically disadvantaged, cannot afford such high prices. There's also the implication for locations, because typically locations near stations, right, will experience increase in housing prices. So this is a study in Thailand that I did a few years ago. So some colleague, and we did find evidence that the creative class, which means all of you in the audience, right, with university degrees, are the ones who will be attracted to locations near transportation stations or subway stations or things of that nature, but not others with lower educational attainment, not those with a lower income status who cannot afford the high prices of living next to a transportation infrastructure. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your patience. And I look forward to having a productive conversation.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Yuri. It was a very stimulating presentation, yeah, that makes us think about our country development as well. We have received several questions, and I think we are going to start the Q&A session from the first question, which is from Diaz Arfa. So the question is, if urban is a positive thing, do you think that aggressive rural tourism development is a good idea or not?
Tourism development, is it a good idea or not? Okay, it's been a few years since I did tourism here. I think the concern about tourism, so the general answer is yes, but with some caveat, right? So I was in Bali actually, last August, to spend some time with my family on a vacation, and obviously Bali is a highly developed for tourism. So for Bali, it is a strategy that has worked well. For other places, there is some concerns about sustainability, right? What is the degree to which we'll be able to preserve our national heritage? Think about Borobudur. There is a recent debate, about the cost of going to the top, if I remember it correctly. And one way to address that problem is to increase the entry cost, right? And that obviously creates another set of issues, including some people will not be able to afford, the cost of entering this tourism facilities. So in general, I am in support of tourism activities, but I think, given the choices between tourism and other activities, I would go for more knowledge-oriented activities. Activities that contribute to innovation and things like that, including university. You can think of it as a knowledge industry. Industrial activities that potentially can generate or contribute to innovations. My inclination is to go for that instead of going for tourism. For a reason that I already talked about, a concern about the sustainability.
Okay, thank you. So sustainability is one area that needs to be considered, yeah, along the way with the aggressive development. So the second question is from Timothy from Universitas Indonesia. It's talking about the new capital city of Indonesia, which is projected to be moved in 2024. What could be the factors to accelerate agglomeration economies in the new city where all the facilities are just newly developed?
Yeah. So first of all, there is no guarantee here that any strategy is going to accelerate, agglomeration. I was in Korea for 4 years, between 2006 and 2010, and I was in that conversation when they were moving some of the government offices from Seoul to this city called Sejong. And what ended up happening right now is that some of this civil servants or government officials and also researchers, will work in Sejong City, okay, and then in the weekend they will go back to their home, to their home in Seoul. So basically, Sejong City is becoming a commuter town, right? So there is no real agglomeration economies that are happening. It's a pretty much artificial. I was also in Canberra 2019 before the pandemic started. Why is Canberra interesting? Because there's an example of artificially created capital city. It's not an organically grown capital city, right? So Canberra is nice. That is the Australian National University, and people are nice, but it can never be as vibrant as Sydney or Melbourne, right? So despite the best of intention, and Australia is one of the developed economies, it hasn't been successful in making Canberra as vibrant as Sydney or Melbourne, or maybe that's not the intention. I don't know. In the case of Nusantara, which I think is the name of the new capital city, the Kalimantan Barat, I think that there is two objectives here, and they're not necessarily consistent with one another. Potentially, we have a trade-off. If the goal is promoting regional equity, right? That is the goal that Pak Jokowi, I think, is pursuing by moving some of the activities outside of Java. Then we will pursue, right, this goal of more equal development outside of Java. But that might come at the cost of lower overall growth, because anytime we decrease concentration, that means, according to the evidence, we'll have less productivity and therefore lower growth. Although at the same time, we might be compensated by more equity, at least regional equity. But it's a tough question. My suggestion right now is based on what we know about cities and how they work, is to consider the importance of complementarities. And what that means is, if we have to move, we may have to do it simultaneously. So it's not sequentially one at a time, but simultaneously. So it's not just the offices, but also the schools, right? Because the children of the government officials will have to go somewhere. Right now in Bukit Suharto, if that's the name, there's nothing there. It's practically nothing right now for there. So what is the suggestion here to promote agglomeration economies going forward is to do everything, if not simultaneously, then several sectors have to move together at the same time, because it is this complementarity that create agglomeration economies, in terms of sharing, matching, and knowledge spillovers. If some important components are missing, then it will not generate, sufficient agglomeration economies, and therefore productivity, will not increase as a result.
Okay, thank you very much. So again, the collaboration is perhaps the important part as well. And
Absolutely.
We have a lot of questions, but I think we need to limit to the last question now, which is from Atiyah Adika Putri from Universitas Indonesia, talking about, is there any limit on density to gain more of the benefits than the disadvantages of it, both for business and for the people? Because obviously there's a contradicting result from the research you mentioned above.
Yeah, great. So there is a literature that I didn't have time to talk about, and I'm actually not an expert in that area, but I know the literature that talks about the optimal city size. And the notion of the optimal city size is not universal. In other words, there is no one number that we can apply to all cities. Okay, it depends on the context. So what is the most important context here? It turns out that the optimal city size, the optimal density, is higher for cities with more developed infrastructure. So this is important, right? Because what that means is that if you want to generate, productivity, higher productivity, promote higher productivity through agglomeration economies by encouraging people, to live in cities, then you're going to have the infrastructure to do that. because only by having sufficient facilities, infrastructure facilities, that we'll be able to accommodate more people. Just to take a simplest example, right, that I already talked about, people have to live somewhere. So need to have that kind of infrastructure, housing infrastructure, so people, can have shelter, right? Other facilities like electricity, and power in general, water, clean water access, right? They all have to be more developed if we want to accommodate more people. So thank you for allowing me to talk about that.
Okay, so Professor Yuri, I think your answer concludes our Q&A session for now. Thank you so much to be our distinguished speaker, and as a token of appreciation, the organizing committee has prepared a virtual certificate for you as well, and we are going to take a moment to take a photograph with you, certificate, and this. Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Yuri, and we are hoping to see you perhaps in person in the future, yeah?
Thank you. I hope to see you in person next time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think this is the end of the keynote session and the announcement of the Best Paper Awards, and the closing ceremony later on will be held at 1 p.m. Jakarta time. To all the conference participants, you may now switch to the parallel session waiting room. Stay tuned and see you at the closing ceremony.
Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia, that aims to provide an excellent international platform for the academicians, researchers and budding students around the world to share their research findings and to find international linkage for future collaborations in the areas of business, management, and economics. Previously, ICBMR had been held in Bali, Jakarta, Manila, Ho Chi Minh, Seoul, Kyoto, Lombok, Padang, and last year ICBMR is held virtually. The theme for this year is building competitive and collaborative business in the disruptive era. Again, ICBMR is held as a virtual conference where there will be online presentations, doctoral colloquium, and webinar keynote speeches. Our keynote speakers are Professor Kiyoshi Kobayashi from Kyoto University and Associate Professor Yuri Mansury from Illinois Institute of Technology. The supporting journal for ICBMR 2022 are Indonesian Capital Market Review, ASEAN Marketing Journal, the Southeast Asian Journal of Management, International Journal of Islamic Microfinance, Journal Pendidikan Ekonomi dan Bisnis, and supporting publisher UI Publishing for proceeding. Our special thanks to our sponsors Pertamina, Bank Rakyat Indonesia, and Bank Central Asia. ICBMR is organized by Management Research Center, Department of Management, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia, that aims to provide an excellent international platform for the academicians, researchers and budding students around the world to share their research findings and to find international linkage for future collaborations in the areas of business, management, and economics. Previously, ICBMR had been held in Bali, Jakarta, Manila, Ho Chi Minh, Seoul, Kyoto, Lombok, Padang, and last year ICBMR is held virtually. The theme for this year is building competitive and collaborative business in the disruptive era. Again, ICBMR is held as a virtual conference where there will be online presentations, doctoral colloquium, and webinar keynote speeches. Our keynote speakers are Professor Kiyoshi Kobayashi from Kyoto University and Associate Professor Yuri Mansury from Illinois Institute of Technology. The supporting journal for ICBMR 2022 are Indonesian Capital Market Review, ASEAN Marketing Journal, the Southeast Asian Journal of Management, International Journal of Islamic Microfinance, Journal Pendidikan Ekonomi dan Business, and supporting publisher UI Publishing for proceeding. Our special thanks to our sponsors Pertamina, Bank Rakyat Indonesia, and